Good morning, everyone. This is the second year in a row that I've been invited to speak, so thank you very much for that invitation. Last year, you may remember, talked a little bit about the hydrogen economy. So in the absence of our hydrogen speaker, you can go back into the records there and take a look at my presentation from last year if you want to get a little more knowledge on what's going on in hydrogen. Today, though, I'd like to talk to everyone about some of the policy research that we're doing at the Centre of Urban Energy at Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly referred to as Ryerson University. And I think we'll find it quite interesting in terms of an overview of what's been going on in North America and what lessons might be for us as the ministry is currently putting forward policy on carbon capture and sequestration in our province. So this particular slide gives you an indication as to what is required in terms of carbon capture. But I titled it, this slide, around carbon capture and sequestration as, is it the answer, the question? I think we have to be quite pragmatic about things. Carbon capture is really starting to take off around the world as a possible solution. Driven principally by the recognition that we are not going to meet our goals in terms of reducing carbon in the globe and globally. So the idea of maybe capturing it becomes, I think, an important goal for us going forward. The economics, however, still remain to be determined. But certainly from a technical perspective, it would appear to be a viable area for us to pursue. But notice that by 2030, if we were to meet the goals that we're looking at, the amount of carbon capture that would have to take place. And it's a tremendous leap when we consider what the pathway currently looks like in regards to operating projects, carbon capture projects, those under construction, those that are in an advanced development stage going forward, and those which are still in the concept and feasibility stage. The net zero emissions goal would represent that top part of the final bar in 2030. You can see we have a very ambitious goal going forward. In terms of what's been going on in carbon capture and sequestration, you can see the amount of investment that's been going into it in terms of the amount of dollars being spent to capture the carbon. It is starting to take off. The VCs, the venture capitalists, are looking at it very closely. Industry is looking at it very closely in terms of making internal investments towards carbon capture. And what you can see is that in 2021, the principal driver of investment was industry. And I know that I think Matthew is here from Sarnia Lambton Economic Development Group, and they have a working group looking at carbon capture, and it becomes a significant area for them and the industrial customers in Sarnia. Now, I have to admit, when it comes to North America, the Americans are way ahead of us. This slide gives you an idea of some of the legislative activity that's been going on in various states around the United States. And for the most part, legislation has been put in place around carbon capture and sequestration in those states that are obviously in the oil and gas industry. And you can see the various oil and gas basins that exist and the areas of which we would be looking at the carbon capture. And I'll show you a slide in a second as to what's currently active. What is interesting is you can see that the state of Massachusetts has legislation that will allow emitters the opportunity to actually move carbon outside of the state and to transport it into other states for the purposes of sequestration. So even though they're, arguably offshore, there's some sedimentary rock, but for the most part, the state of Massachusetts is just saying, look, we recognize it's a problem and we want legislation in place that allows emitters to move it to places like Pennsylvania, where they may be able to find the natural reservoirs to sequester. As I said, these are the carbon capture sequestration projects currently in the United States. One of the things that should be noted is that for the most part, active operations exist as part of enhanced oil recovery. And I talked about that last year, about the importance of us using enhanced oil recovery projects to sequester carbon as a first step towards commercializing what we would like to see in the future, which is the sequestration of carbon purely for the sake of sequestering carbon. But the economics, as we know, still are a little elusive in terms of justifying just a straight carbon capture mechanism. So let's just talk about what does exist in terms of legislation in the United States. So when you go through what's happened amongst all the states, I've summarized it simply here. One of the most important things that you recognize is that the legislation that has been enacted for the most part recognizes the primacy of mineral rights. And again, I need to qualify that by pointing out that in many of those states, it's freehold rights. So the landowner owns the mineral rights and essentially leases it like we do onshore here in Ontario. So legislation recognizes that right first and foremost when it comes to carbon capture. So I'll talk about it in a second and lessons learned, but I think it's important for us to recognize that any type of policy that's implemented in Ontario needs to should recognize this going forward. The ownership of the pore space, again, rests with the surface estate owner. Unitization, which is quite common in the oil and gas industry, is also something that the legislation on carbon capture has now or does employ within the legislation to allow for unitizing pore space. And then the application for a permit, again, I think that's pretty much boilerplate. The legislation makes it very clear what needs to be done in order to be permitted to sequester carbon. Now, some of these other points in the legislation I think are interesting and worth consideration. Facility trust fund. So there are charges in the legislation. States will charge a fee per ton of carbon that is sequestered and put it into a trust fund to be used as a legacy for the future to make sure that the facilities remain secure and intact going forward, and that the state government has the funds to do so. You have to have legislation, or this legislation should say, has clauses in it that deal with drilling near it, a carbon storage facility, in much the same way as we currently have legislation in Ontario related to underground natural gas storage. The CO2 ownership rests with the CO2 sequestering company for the immediate term. As you'll see in a second, most legislation in the states allows for the transfer of the liability of the sequestration of the CO2 back to the state at a time when the CO2 sequestration operator is now done with the project. So when we talk about Canada, just very quickly, we have our two, we have one major sedimentary basin in Western Canada, and then we have what we share in Ontario with Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio. And you can see from this particular slide, the major emitters are plotted on it. So we can see that we do have a market for sequestering the CO2 proximal to these basins. So there is a tremendous amount of potential geologically for us going forward. We look at other Canadian provinces. We have Alberta. Alberta has legislation in place. It essentially allows for permitting of carbon capture and sequestration. But what's important in that legislation that they brought on to do that was that under their Oil and Gas Conservation Act, it still requires that any approval of a CO2 sequestration project will not interfere with the recovery or conservation of oil and gas. So again, the notion of the primacy of oil and gas rights over carbon sequestration. In British Columbia, which is a more recent legislation that was enacted, we see that the British Columbia government, again, Crown rights, have stated essentially you got to have an oil and gas lease or a permit of some sort related to production of petroleum and natural gas or storage of petroleum and natural gas, and then you can apply for a license for CO2 sequestration. I think what we see is that the province also, which is what we're contemplating in Ontario, provisions within their Oil and Gas Activities Act to allow special projects that deal with carbon capture and sequestration. So what are our lessons for Ontario? Well, I think first and foremost, we have to recognize the complexity that Ontario has. In Alberta and in British Columbia, the Crown rights for oil and gas exist. In the States, the United States, except for offshore Texas, it's the freehold rights system. We have both. So that our legislation, our policy has to recognize that. The other lesson is that pore space ownership for the carbon storage. It needs to be consistent with pore space ownership for natural gas storage or CAS or CASE. So I think we already know we have natural gas storage operations, and we're about to hopefully have CAS. We do have the one project and maybe another when it comes to compressed air. So I don't think it's a huge leap in terms of policy development and legislation to address carbon storage. We have a unitization process that existed in this province for many, many decades. That can be employed as well. We need to establish, I think this is a very important one, the post-closure liability issue around carbon capture, as opposed to natural gas storage, which continues to ongo. Once we've filled the reservoir with CO2, it's done. So this is an important element that needs to be addressed for us. And I think the other thing is that any legislation that is put into place by the province of Ontario needs to look very, very closely at the economics in order to, or the impact it has on the economics in order to encourage carbon capture development. And I'm happy to answer any questions during the Q&A period afterwards. Thank you.